On the 7th of May, 1931, 150 policemen surrounded an apartment building on the west side of New York. They cut a hole in the roof. They pumped in tear gas. 10,000 people stood in the street to watch. Inside was a young man the newspapers called Two-Gun Crowley, a cop killer. A week earlier, a policeman had asked him for his license, and Crowley had shot him dead where he stood. And now, bleeding, with bullets coming through the walls, he was writing a letter. To whom it may concern, it said, "Under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm." Later, strapped into the electric chair at Sing Sing, he did not say, "This is what I get for killing people." He said, "This is what I get for defending myself." Read that again. A cop killer who blamed himself for nothing. Here is the uncomfortable part. Crowley is not the exception. He is the rule, turned all the way up. The warden of Sing Sing said it plainly. Almost none of the criminals in his prison thought of themselves as bad men. Al Capone called himself a public benefactor, an unappreciated and misunderstood public benefactor. If criticism cannot reach a murderer, what makes you think it will reach your colleague? A man named Dale Carnegie had been chewing on that question since 1912, teaching public speaking in New York. And when his students kept asking how to handle people, he went looking for the book that would tell them. 2 organizations had already spent $25,000 finding out what adults wanted to learn. The answer came back: health first, people second. But one of them told Carnegie the truth. "I know what those adults want," he said, "but the book they need has never been written." So he wrote it. He hired a researcher for a year and a half. They read over 100 biographies of Theodore Roosevelt alone. It began as rules on a postcard, grew into a leaflet, then booklets. This book wasn't written in the usual sense of the word, he said. It grew as a child grows. And Rule 1 came from a man who had every excuse to break it. July 1863. Gettysburg is over. Lee is retreating, trapped against a flooded river, and Lincoln orders General Meade to attack and end the war. Meade calls a council of war and does nothing. Lee escapes. Lincoln is beside himself. He sits down and writes, "I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably." Every word of it justified, every word of it true. Meade never read that letter. Lincoln never sent it. It was found among his papers after he died. Carnegie's guess, and he is careful to call it only a guess, is that Lincoln looked out the window and asked himself what it was actually like at Gettysburg and put the letter down. Because criticism, Carnegie says, is futile. It puts a person on the defensive and makes them strain to justify themselves. It is dangerous because it wounds a person's precious pride and arouses resentment. Criticisms are like homing pigeons. They always return home. Any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, he writes, and most fools do. But it takes character and self-control to be understanding and forgiving. That is principle 1, and there are 29 more behind it. Don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Which raises an obvious problem. If you can't push people, what on earth moves them? Money, you'd think? Charles Schwab was one of the first men in America paid over $1 million a year, $3,000 a day, at a time when $50 a week made you comfortable. Andrew Carnegie, no relation to Dale, paid him that to run a steel company. Why? Not because Schwab knew the most about steel. He said himself that men under him knew far more. "I am hearty in my approbation and lavish in my praise," Schwab said. That is his line, not Dale Carnegie's, and it is the most expensive sentence in the book. The philosopher John Dewey called the deepest urge in human nature the desire to be important. William James called it the craving to be appreciated. Freud called it the desire to be great. 3 of the sharpest minds of the age circling the same hunger, and almost nobody feeds it. Now, you are already objecting. Isn't this just flattery? Carnegie gets there before you. The difference, he says, is simple. One is sincere, and the other insincere. One comes from the heart out. the other from the teeth out. One is unselfish, the other selfish. Flattery is telling the other person precisely what he thinks about himself. There is a bust of a Mexican general, Alvaro Obregón, that carries the warning: don't be afraid of enemies who attack you. Be afraid of the friends who flatter you. So, honest and sincere appreciation. Principle 2. Rockefeller once had a partner lose $1 million on a bad deal. He could have destroyed him. Instead, he pointed out the man had salvaged 60% and said, "That's splendid. We don't always do as well as that upstairs." Appreciation is the rarest currency there is, and still nobody's told you how to make someone want something. Carnegie's answer is the strangest sentence in the book, and it is about fishing. Personally, he says, I am very fond of strawberries and cream, but for some strange reason, fish prefer worms. So when I go fishing, I don't think about what I want. I think about what they want. Emerson and his son once tried to get a calf into a barn. They pushed and pulled, and the calf braced its legs. The Irish housemaid came out, put her finger in the calf's mouth, and let it suck her finger into the barn. She couldn't write essays. She had more calf sense than Emerson. Henry Ford put it flatly: if there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view. Principle 3. And Carnegie takes the wording from the psychologist Harry Overstreet: arouse in the other person an eager want. Carnegie used it on his own landlord. He rented a hotel ballroom 20 nights a season for his lectures. One year, with the tickets already printed, the manager told him the rent was going up 300%. Carnegie went to see him, and he did not argue. He took a sheet of paper, drew 2 columns, advantages and disadvantages, and filled them in from the manager's side of the desk. Advantages: the ballroom free for dances, which pay far more than lectures. Disadvantages: Carnegie's rent, gone, and 250 cultured people coming to your hotel 20 nights a year, the best advertising money cannot buy. He never once mentioned what he wanted. The rent went up 50% instead of 300. That's the first 3. They're the foundation. Now comes the part everyone actually shows up for: how to make people like you. When Carnegie was 5, his father bought him a yellow-haired pup for 50 cents. Tippy waited for him at the front of the house every afternoon at 4:30. For 5 years. And then, on a night Carnegie never forgot, lightning killed Tippy within 10 feet of his head. Here is what he took from a dog. A dog is the only animal that doesn't have to work for a living. A hen lays eggs. A cow gives milk. A canary sings. A dog makes his living by giving you nothing but love. Tippy never read a book on psychology. He didn't need to. You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming genuinely interested in other people. Carnegie writes, than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. Read it twice. It is the whole book in one sentence. Howard Thurston was the greatest magician of his age. 40 years, 60 million paid admissions, nearly $2 million in profit. A boy who ran away from home, rode boxcars, and learned to read from the signs on the side of them. He told Carnegie his tricks were nothing special. Books had been written on his magic. Dozens of men knew as much as he did. The difference was 2 things. He could put his personality across, and before he walked on stage, every single night, he said this to himself: I love my audience. I love my audience. Compare that to the magicians who looked at the crowd and thought, a bunch of suckers out there. Alfred Adler wrote that it is the individual who is not interested in his fellow men who has the greatest difficulties in life. Principle 1 of 6. Become genuinely interested in other people. And the second one costs nothing at all. William Steinhardt was, by his own cheerful admission, one of the worst grouches who ever walked down Broadway. Married 18 years, and he rarely smiled at his wife between waking up and leaving for work. Carnegie challenged him to smile at somebody every hour for a week. The next morning, Steinhardt combed his hair, told his own reflection to wipe the scowl off its face, and said, "Good morning, my dear," with a smile. His wife was bewildered, shocked. Within 2 months, he said, there was more happiness in his home than in the whole of the previous year. William James explained the mechanism. Action seems to follow feeling, but really action and feeling go together. Act and speak as if cheerfulness were already there. You don't smile because you're happy. You are about as happy as you make up your mind to be, and that line is Lincoln's. Principle 2. Smile. There is a passage on smiling that people have been quoting for 90 years, usually with Carnegie's name on it. It costs nothing, but creates much. It enriches those who receive, without impoverishing those who give. It happens in a flash, and the memory of it sometimes lasts forever. Beautiful. And Carnegie didn't write a word of it. He tells you so himself. It was a New York department store's Christmas advertisement, printed for shoppers during the rush, titled "The Value of a Smile at Christmas." He simply thought it was true and reprinted it. It ends with the line the store put in a newspaper to sell things. If some of our salespeople should be too tired to give you a smile, may we ask you to leave one of yours? For nobody needs a smile so much as those who have none left to give. Carnegie's genius was rarely invention. It was noticing. In 1898, a man was walking to a child's funeral in Stony Point, New York, when a horse kicked both heels in the air and killed him. That week, the village had 2 funerals instead of 1. His son, Jim Farley, was 10. He went to work in a brickyard and never saw the inside of a high school. By 46, he had 4 honorary degrees, chaired a national political party, and was Postmaster General of the United States. Carnegie asked him his secret. "Hard work," Farley said. "Don't be funny," Carnegie replied. And then he guessed, "I understand you can call 10,000 people by their first names." "No," Farley said. "You are wrong. I can call 50,000 people by their first names." Because the average person, Carnegie writes, is more interested in his or her own name than in all the other names on earth put together. A salesman named Sid Levy had a customer everyone in the neighborhood called Nick. His actual name was Nicodemus Papadoulos. Levy practiced it out loud several times before he walked in. Then he greeted the man by his whole, real, 4-syllable name. There was a long pause, and then the man began to cry. "Mr. Levy," he said, "in all the 15 years I have been in this country, nobody has ever made the effort to call me by my right name. 15 years, nobody." Principle 3, and note the exact wording, because the version you've heard is from the older edition. Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Not the English language, any language. It cost you 8 seconds of practice. It bought that man's loyalty for life. And the next principle is even lazier. You barely have to speak at all. At a dinner party in New York, Carnegie sat next to a botanist and did essentially nothing for several hours. He asked questions. He leaned in. He listened. He was, in his own words, charmed, and he said almost nothing himself. When he left, the botanist turned to the host and paid Carnegie a series of compliments, ending with the verdict that he was a most interesting conversationalist. Carnegie's reaction is the funniest line in the book. "I didn't know any more about botany," he says, "than I knew about the anatomy of a penguin." A woolen merchant named Detmer once had a customer travel all the way to Chicago to shout that he would never pay his bill and never buy from him again. Detmer thanked him for coming, wiped the charge, and recommended his competitors. The man went home, placed the largest order of his life, and named his son Detmer. Why does that work? Because, Carnegie says, we are not dealing with creatures of logic. We are dealing with creatures of emotion, creatures bristling with prejudices and motivated by pride and vanity. A person's toothache means more to that person than a famine that kills 1 million people on the other side of the world. Harsh. Also true. Lincoln once summoned an old friend from Springfield all the way to Washington to talk over the Emancipation Proclamation. He talked for hours. Then he shook the man's hand and sent him home, without ever asking his opinion. He hadn't wanted advice. He had wanted a friendly, sympathetic listener. Principle 4. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. Or, as Carnegie puts it in 5 words that ought to be tattooed somewhere, To be interesting, be interested. Which tells you what to listen for. Theodore Roosevelt had a habit his guests never quite got over. The night before anyone visited, he sat up late reading about whatever that person cared about most. Because Roosevelt knew what every leader knows. The royal road to a person's heart is to talk about the things they treasure most. Edward Chalif needed a company to sponsor a boy for a scout jamboree in Europe. He had heard the president of that company had once written a check for $1 million and had it framed after it was canceled. So Chalif walked in and asked to see it. He said he'd never heard of anyone writing a check that big, and he wanted to tell his boys he'd seen it with his own eyes. The man was delighted. He showed him the check. He told him the story. Chalif hadn't mentioned the jamboree once. Only at the end did the executive ask what Chalif had actually come about. Chalif told him, and the man didn't send one boy. He sent 5, and Chalif himself gave them $1,000 letter of credit, told them to stay 7 weeks, met them personally in Paris, and afterwards gave some of the boys jobs. Principle 5. Talk in terms of the other person's interests. Now, you'll have noticed something about that story, and Carnegie noticed it too. It looks like a technique. It looks like a man performing interest in a check in order to get money out of a stranger. Hold that thought. Carnegie is going to answer it in his own words, and his answer is the reason this book has outlived every other book of its kind. But first, the 6th way, and the one he calls the single most important law in this book. James Adamson had 10 minutes to sell chairs to George Eastman, the man who built Kodak. He'd been warned, be brief or you lose the sale. Adamson walked in, looked at the room, and said he'd never seen a more beautiful office. He'd like to have paneling like that himself. Eastman said nobody noticed it anymore. Then he showed him the woodwork. Then he told him about his mother's boarding house, about poverty, about the dry plate experiments he ran until dawn. 2 hours later, he took Adamson home for lunch to show him chairs he had painted himself. Adamson got the $90,000 order. He also got a friend for the rest of Eastman's life. The law is this, Carnegie writes, always make the other person feel important. And Emerson, every man I meet is my superior in some way. In that, I learn of him. It works on 9-year-olds too, which is how you know it is real. A man named Ronald Rowland taught art. One of his students, Chris, was shy, the kind of boy who wants something badly and never asks. Rowland asked him if he'd like to be in the advanced class. Chris's answer is the whole of human psychology in 6 words. Who, me, Mr. Rowland? Am I good enough? Yes, Chris, Rowland said. You are good enough. The boy walked out of that room 2 inches taller. Rowland went home and hung a sign in his classroom that said, simply, you are important. Principle 6. Make the other person feel important, and do it sincerely. That last clause is not decoration. Carnegie put it there on purpose. That's 6 ways to make people like you. But liking you isn't agreeing with you. And that is a much harder problem. Carnegie learned this one by being humiliated in public. At a banquet in London, the man beside him quoted a line and said it came from the Bible. Carnegie knew, absolutely, arrogantly knew, that it was Shakespeare. So he said so. The man insisted. Carnegie turned to his old friend Frank Gammon, a Shakespeare scholar, who was sitting right there. Gammon kicked him under the table and said, Dale, you are wrong. The gentleman is right. It is from the Bible. Walking home, Carnegie was furious. Frank, he said, you know that line is from Hamlet. Yes, Gammon said. Act 5. Scene 2. But we were guests at a festive occasion. Why prove to a man he is wrong? Always avoid the acute angle. Carnegie never forgot it, and he wrote the flattest sentence in the book about it. You can't win an argument. You can't win an argument, he says, because if you lose it, you lose it, and if you win it, you lose it. Why? Suppose you triumph. You shoot the other man's argument full of holes. You prove him wrong. Then what? You feel fine. He feels inferior. You've hurt his pride, and he resents your triumph. And a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. 9 times out of 10, Carnegie says an argument ends with each side more firmly convinced than ever that they were absolutely right. Benjamin Franklin saw it too. If you argue and rankle and contradict, you may achieve a victory sometimes, but it will be an empty victory because you will never get your opponent's goodwill. Principle 1 of 12, and it is not a suggestion. The only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. So what do you do instead? You never tell them they're wrong. Not with words, not with a look, not with a tone. Carnegie's example is a lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court of the United States. A justice asked him whether the statute of limitations in admiralty was 6 years. The lawyer stopped, stared, and said flatly, "Your Honor, there is no statute of limitations in admiralty." A hush fell on the court. He told Carnegie afterwards, "The temperature seemed to drop to 0. I was right. He was wrong. And I had told him so." But did that make him friendly? No. I still believe I had the law on my side. But I didn't persuade. There's magic. Carnegie says positive magic in phrases like these. I may be wrong. I frequently am. Let's examine the facts. Principle 2. Show respect for the other person's opinions. Never say you're wrong. Franklin learned the same lesson, and it cost him more. When Franklin was young and insufferable, an old Quaker friend took him aside and took him apart. "Ben, you are impossible," he said. "Your opinions have a slap in them for everyone who differs with you. Your friends find they enjoy themselves better when you are not around. You are not likely ever to know any more than you do now, which is very little." Franklin's response is why we still read him. He accepted it. He made a rule to forbear all direct contradiction. He banned the words certainly and undoubtedly from his mouth. Instead, he said, "I conceive, I apprehend. It so appears to me at present." He went from the worst-tempered man in the room to a diplomat who charmed France into funding a revolution. That's what it costs. And the third principle costs more, because it means saying the sentence nobody wants to say. Carnegie used to walk his little Boston Bulldog, Rex, in Forest Park. No leash, no muzzle, because Rex wouldn't hurt anyone. A mounted policeman caught them and told him, in language that did not invite discussion, to muzzle the dog or tell it to the judge. So Carnegie did it a few more times and got caught again. But this time, he didn't wait. He got in first. "Officer," he said, "you've caught me red-handed. I'm guilty. I have no alibis, no excuses. You warned me last week." And something strange happened. The policeman started defending him. "It's such a little dog," he said. "Just let him run over the hill there where I can't see him, and we'll forget all about it." Carnegie had taken the officer's lines away from him. There was nothing left to say but the opposite. If you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. And the man who proved it commanded an army. Third day at Gettysburg. Pickett's men walk into the Union guns and are torn apart. Lee's invasion of the North is finished, and with it, in the end, the Confederacy. Lee could have blamed Pickett. He could have blamed Longstreet, who had argued against the charge. He could have blamed the ground, the intelligence, the hour. He wrote to his president and asked to be replaced by a younger and abler man. Then he rode out alone to meet the survivors coming back. And he said this, "All this has been my fault. I and I alone have lost this battle." Any fool can defend his mistakes, Carnegie writes, and most fools do. It raises you above the herd to admit them. Principle 3. Now, how do you open? In 1915, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was the most hated man in Colorado. 2 years of the bloodiest strike in American industry. Men had died. His name was a curse in every mining town in the state. He had to stand in a room and talk to the men who had wanted him dead. He could have brought lawyers and figures. Instead, he spent weeks first, making friends, meeting families, visiting homes. Then he stood up and began, "This is a red-letter day in my life. It is the first time I have ever had the good fortune to meet the representatives of the employees of this great company, and I assure you that I am proud to be here." Not a word about wages. He talked about their families. He said he was there as a friend. The strikers went back to work. They never mentioned the raise again. Lincoln said it best, and he said it was not original. A drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. If you would win a man to your cause, he said, first convince him that you are his sincere friend. Woodrow Wilson put the reverse. If you come at me with your fist doubled, I think I can promise you that mine will double as fast as yours. Aesop got there 2,500 years earlier. The wind and the sun bet on who could get a traveler's coat off. The wind blew harder and harder, and the man clutched it tighter. Then the sun came out and smiled, and he took it off himself. Gentleness and friendliness are always stronger than fury and force. Principle 4. Begin in a friendly way. Then get them nodding. And there's a technique for that, 24 centuries old. Socrates walked around Athens barefoot, at 70, marrying a 19-year-old and doing something nobody had done before. He didn't tell people they were wrong. He asked questions they had to agree with, and then more, and more, until they had accepted a conclusion they'd have fought to the death a few minutes earlier. The psychologist Harry Overstreet explained why it works. A no response is the most difficult handicap to overcome. When you say no, your entire organism, glandular, nervous, muscular, gathers itself into a condition of rejection. The whole body goes on guard. A yes, and nothing withdraws. The organism is forward-moving, accepting, open. Joseph Allison had spent 13 years failing to sell motors to an engineer who insisted they ran too hot to touch. So Allison stopped arguing and started asking, "Isn't the industry standard 72 degrees above room temperature?" "Yes." "And isn't your mill room about 75 degrees?" "Yes." "So if the standard is 72 above and your room is 75, that's 147 degrees. Wouldn't you scald your hand on a 147-degree water tap?" "Yes." "Then," Allison said, "wouldn't it be a good idea to keep your hands off the motors?" He didn't win an argument. He never had one. He walked out with $35,000 of business. Principle 5. Get the other person saying yes, yes, immediately. And the sixth principle is the one that terrifies people, because it asks you to shut up. Most of us, when we want something, talk. We push. We fill the silence with reasons. Carnegie says the reasons are precisely the problem, because they are your reasons, and nobody was ever persuaded by somebody else's. There is a salesman in this book who lost his voice on the most important morning of his life. He was one of several firms bidding for a huge upholstery contract, and on the day of the final pitch, he woke up with laryngitis. He could barely whisper. He went anyway. He was shown into a room with the president, the textile engineer, the sales manager. And he wrote on a pad, "Gentlemen, I have lost my voice. I am speechless." The president said, "I'll do your talking for you." And he did. He showed the samples. He praised their merits. He argued the case and then argued the other side of it for the man who couldn't speak. The contract came to over $1.5 million. "I know I would have lost it," the man said, "if I hadn't lost my voice." It works on people you love too, and there it matters more. Barbara Wilson had a daughter, Laurie, who had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. She lectured. She threatened. She punished. Nothing. One evening, out of pure exhaustion, she gave up and simply asked, "Why, Laurie? Why?" And Laurie said, "Do you really want to know?" She did, and it came out, all of it, and their relationship changed for good. Her mother had spent months talking. She had never once let the girl finish a sentence. La Rochefoucauld saw the trap 300 years ago. If you want enemies, excel your friends. But if you want friends, let your friends excel you. Principle 6. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking, which sets up the strangest one of all, where you don't just stop talking. You give away the idea itself. Eugene Wesson sold sketches to stylists. For 3 years, he called on one buyer every single week. He made about 150 calls. He made 0 sales. Then he tried something that sounds like surrender. He picked up half a dozen unfinished sketches, deliberately unfinished, and walked in and said, "Will you do me a favor?" Here are some incomplete sketches. Won't you tell me how we could finish them up in such a way that you could use them? The buyer kept them for days. Wesson came back, and the buyer told him his own ideas for finishing them. Wesson finished them that way. Everyone was accepted. I realize now why I had failed for years, he said. I had been urging him to buy what I thought he should have. I didn't have to sell him. He bought. Principle 7. Let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. Colonel House was the most powerful unelected man in Washington under Woodrow Wilson, and he did it the same way. I learned the best way to convert him to an idea, House said, was to plant it in his mind casually, so as to get him thinking about it on his own account. And then, House said, I was amazed to hear him trot out my suggestion as his own. Did House correct him? Did he say that was mine? He did not. House wanted results, not credit. 2,500 years ago, Lao Tzu asked why rivers and seas receive the homage of 100 mountain streams, because they keep below them. Remember, Carnegie says other people may be totally wrong, but they don't think so. Any fool can condemn them. Try to understand them. Principle 8. Try honestly to see things from the other person's point of view. Carnegie says that if you get only one thing from this entire book, let it be that. Here's the phrase he gives you. It stops arguments dead, and you can use it this afternoon. I don't blame you one iota for feeling as you do. If I were you, I would undoubtedly feel just as you do. And he means it literally. If you'd been born to the parents Al Capone was born to, raised where he was raised, you'd be roughly where he ended up. The only reason you are not a rattlesnake, Carnegie writes, is that your mother and father weren't rattlesnakes. 3/4 of the people you will ever meet are hungering for sympathy. Give it to them, and they will love you. Principle 9. Be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires. The impresario Sol Hurok proved it on the most difficult singer alive. Fyodor Shaliapin was the greatest bass of his generation, and on concert days, he was a disaster. At noon, he would telephone, Sol, I feel terrible. My throat is like ground hamburger. It is impossible for me to sing tonight. Hurok never argued. He went to the hotel dripping with sympathy. My poor fellow, he'd say. What a pity. Of course you cannot sing. I will cancel the engagement at once. It will only cost you a few $1,000s. It is nothing compared to your reputation. Shaliapin would sigh and say, perhaps come back at 5. See how I feel. At 5, more sympathy, more canceling. At 7:30, the great bass would consent to sing, on condition that Hurok announce he had a bad cold. Hurok would promise, and Shaliapin would walk out and sing magnificently. Principle 10 asks something harder. What do you appeal to? J. Pierpont Morgan said a person usually has 2 reasons for doing a thing, one that sounds good and a real one. People know their real reason, but everyone is idealist enough to want to think about the motive that sounds good. So, Carnegie says, appeal to that one. A landlord named Hamilton Farrell had a tenant threatening to break his lease 4 months early. 4 months of rent, walking out the door. Farrell had the contract. He could have fought. Instead, he told the man he simply didn't believe he was the type to walk out on his word, that he'd watched him and judged him a man of his word, and was willing to take a chance on it. The tenant came back and paid. He stayed. He said his wife had insisted because keeping their word was the only honorable thing. This is the day of dramatization, Carnegie writes. Merely stating a truth isn't enough. The truth has to be made vivid, interesting, dramatic. You have to use showmanship. James Boynton had a long report to deliver on cold cream. He'd done the research. He knew the market. On his first attempt, he got dragged into an argument about methodology and got nowhere. Second time, he walked into the office and dumped 32 jars of cold cream on the man's desk. Every competing product, each one tagged with its own findings. The man picked them up, one by one. He asked questions. He got interested. He asked for more time. 10 minutes became an hour. Same facts, same figures, entirely different result. A salesman named Jim Yeamans couldn't get a grocer to look at his cash registers, so he threw a handful of pennies on the floor. The grocer looked. "That's your money," Yeamans said. "It's on the floor." Charles Schwab had a mill manager whose men wouldn't make their quota. The manager had tried everything, pleading, pushing, threatening to fire the lot of them. Schwab arrived at the end of the day shift and asked for a piece of chalk. He turned to the nearest man and asked how many heats his shift had made. 6, the man said. Schwab chalked a big number 6 on the floor and walked out without another word. The night shift came in, saw the 6, and asked what it meant. The day men told them. Next morning, the 6 had been rubbed out and replaced with a 7. The day shift saw the 7. They were not going to be shown up by the night shift. They finished with an enormous, swaggering 10. "The way to get things done," Schwab said, "is to stimulate competition, not in a sordid money-getting way, but in the desire to excel." Principle 12. Throw down a challenge. That is what every successful person loves. The game. So, don't criticize. Appreciate. Arouse a want. Be interested. Smile. Use names. Listen. Talk their interests. Make them feel important. Avoid arguments. Never say you're wrong. Admit fault. Begin friendly. Get a yes. Let them talk. Let it be their idea. See their view. Sympathize. Appeal to the noble. Dramatize. Challenge. 21 down. 9 to go. And they're the hardest. Because now you're not making a friend or winning a point. You're changing somebody. Without giving offense. Without arousing resentment. Lincoln again, and this time he did send the letter. 1863. He gives command of the Army of the Potomac to General Hooker, a man he has real doubts about, and he writes to tell him so. It does not open with the doubts. "I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac," Lincoln writes. "Of course I have done this upon what appear to me to be sufficient reasons, and yet I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you." Then the knife. Hooker had said the country needed a dictator. Only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators, Lincoln tells him. "What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." And at the end, not a threat, an appeal. Beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance, go forward and give us victories. Beginning with praise, Carnegie says, is like the dentist who begins with Novocaine. The patient still gets a drilling, but the Novocaine is pain-killing. Principle 1. Begin with praise and honest appreciation. Now, a warning about one word. Many people begin with praise and then say, "But, we're really proud of you, Johnny, for raising your marks this term. But if you'd worked harder at algebra, the results would have been better." Johnny feels encouraged right up to the word, but then he doubts the whole thing. The praise was just a run-up to the criticism, and now he doesn't believe the praise either. Change one word. "We're really proud of you, Johnny, for raising your marks. And by continuing the same efforts next term, your algebra can be up with the rest." Same content. He accepts it because no criticism ever arrived. Charles Schwab found some of his men smoking directly beneath a no smoking sign. He did not point at the sign. He handed each man a cigar and said, "I'll appreciate it, boys, if you'll smoke these outside." Principle 2. Call attention to people's mistakes indirectly. In 1909, Prince von Bülow needed the Kaiser of Germany to forgive him for something the Kaiser had done. Wilhelm II had made a series of astonishing statements in a British newspaper and set Europe on fire, and he had insisted von Bülow take the blame for advising him. Von Bülow made one mistake. He said, "I could never have advised your Majesty to say those things." The Kaiser exploded. "You consider me a donkey capable of blunders you yourself could never have committed." Von Bülow knew he should have praised first and criticized after. Too late for that, so he did the next best thing. He praised after. "Your Majesty," he said, "I am shamefully ignorant of all branches of natural science. I know nothing of chemistry or physics, and I cannot explain the simplest natural phenomenon. But in exchange, I know some history and some things useful in politics." The Kaiser beamed. "Haven't I always told you," he said, That we complete one another famously? We should stick together, and we will." He shook von Bülow's hand repeatedly. And that same afternoon, he grew so enthusiastic he said, "If anyone says anything to me against Prince von Bülow, I shall punch him in the nose." Von Bülow saved himself in time, but note what it took. A career diplomat, one of the shrewdest in Europe, made the mistake first and only rescued it by humbling himself afterwards. Carnegie tried it on his own niece, Josephine, 19, and fresh from Kansas, working as his secretary and making a great many errors. He caught himself about to lecture her. Instead, "You have made a mistake, Josephine, but the Lord knows, it's no worse than many I have made." Principle 3. Talk about your own mistakes before criticizing the other person. Ida Tarbell once had dinner with a man who had shared an office with O&D Young for 3 years. In all that time, the man said, he never heard Young give a direct order to anyone. Not once. He always gave suggestions. "You might consider this. Do you think that would work?" Frequently, he'd say, after dictating a letter, "What do you think of that?" He let people do things themselves. He let them learn from their mistakes. A technique like that, Carnegie says, saves a person's pride and gives them a feeling of importance. It makes them want to cooperate instead of rebel. Compare the instructor who found a car blocking his driveway and stormed into a classroom shouting whose car it was and that he'd wrap a chain around it and drag it off. Whose car was it? It didn't matter. From that moment, the whole class made his life difficult. Principle 4. Ask questions instead of giving direct orders. Which brings us to the one Carnegie thinks we trample most. General Electric had a delicate job. Remove Charles Steinmetz as head of a department. Steinmetz was a genius of the first order on electricity and a total failure as a manager. They didn't dare offend him. He was indispensable, and he was sensitive. So they made him consulting engineer of the General Electric Company, a new title for work he was already doing, and they let somebody else head the department. Steinmetz was happy, and so were the officers. They had gently maneuvered their most temperamental star, and they had done it without a storm by letting him save face. Letting one save face, Carnegie writes. How important, how vitally important that is, and how few of us ever stop to think of it. We ride roughshod over other people's feelings and never think twice about it. Here's the cost of not thinking about it. A vice president at Fred Clark's company hauled a supervisor into a meeting in front of his peers and accused him, aggressively, of misrepresenting a production problem. The supervisor had already spent hours dealing with it. He was, as Clark put it, useless to the company from that moment on. Not fired, not demoted, just gone inside. He left for a competitor a few months later, and Clark says he was excellent there. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry wrote the sentence that should end this scene, and it isn't Carnegie's. I have no right to say or do anything that diminishes a man in his own eyes. What matters is not what I think of him, but what he thinks of himself. Hurting a man in his dignity is a crime. Principle 5. Let the other person save face. But stopping the damage isn't the same as growing somebody. Enrico Caruso's first singing teacher told him he had no voice at all. It sounded, he said, like the wind in the shutters. Caruso's mother was a peasant. She had no money, no education, and no reason to know better. She put her arms around him and told him she believed he could sing, that she could already hear the improvement. She went barefoot to pay for his lessons. He became the greatest opera singer of his age. Charles Dickens was working in a rat-infested warehouse and sleeping in an attic with 2 boys from the London slums. He had so little faith in his writing that he crept out and posted his first manuscript in the dead of night, so nobody would see. Story after story came back rejected. Then one was accepted. He was paid nothing. He wandered the streets with tears rolling down his cheeks because one editor had recognized him. H.G. Wells was sleeping under a counter with 2 other apprentices, working 14 hours a day at a draper's shop. So sick of it, he walked 15 miles to tell his mother he'd rather die. One schoolmaster's encouragement, a single teacher's praise, put him in a job teaching, and the 20th century got a different writer. Why, Carnegie wonders, don't we use the same common sense with people that we use with dogs? Why don't we use meat instead of a whip? Why don't we use praise instead of condemnation? Abilities wither under criticism, he writes. They blossom under encouragement. Principle 6 is his longest, and half of it is in quotation marks because half of it is Schwab's. Praise the slightest improvement and praise every improvement. Be hearty in your approbation and lavish in your praise. Not vague praise, specific praise. Say what you saw. There's an old saying, Carnegie writes, give a dog a bad name and you may as well hang him. But give him a good name and see what happens. A fourth-grade teacher in Brooklyn, Ruth Hopkins, looked at her class list for the year and found Tommy T on it. Tommy was the school's problem, brilliant at causing trouble and famous for it. Every teacher who'd had him had complained, loudly. On the first day, she went down the row saying something to each child. Nice dress. You're a fine artist. When she got to Tommy, she looked him in the eye and said, Tommy, I understand you are a natural leader. I'm going to depend on you to help me make this class the best in fourth grade this year. She reinforced it every day for 3 days, and a 9-year-old boy could not let her down. He didn't. Principle 7. Give the other person a fine reputation to live up to. Principle 8 is the one that saved a boy's life, more or less. David Jones was scarred in a car accident as a small child. He was labeled brain injured, put in classes for slow learners, and held back. At 15, he was still counting on his fingers and could not do his multiplication tables. The other kids called him Frankenstein and said his brains had leaked out through the cut on his head. His father did not tell him to try harder. He made it look easy. They used flashcards and a stopwatch. First run, 52 seconds, with errors. Then 48, 45, 44, 41, under 40. Every drop was a celebration. They'd call his mother in. They'd whoop. 8 weeks in, he was doing it in under 8 minutes and asking to go again because it was fun. He got a B in maths. It was the first time in his life anything like that had happened. He took 3rd prize at the city science fair. He made the National Honor Society. Nothing about the boy changed. What changed was one sentence. This is easy and you are getting better. And look, here is the proof, in seconds, on a stopwatch. Lowell Thomas did the same to Carnegie himself. Carnegie had refused to play bridge for years. It was a mystery. It was beyond him. Thomas said, Dale, there's no trick to it. There is nothing to bridge except memory and judgment. You wrote a chapter on memory. It's right up your alley. And Carnegie, who had said no for a decade, sat down and played. Principle 8. Use encouragement. Make the fault seem easy to correct. One left, and it's the one that gives the game away. Napoleon created the Legion of Honor and handed out 15,000 crosses. He made 18 of his generals marshals of France. He called his army the Grand Army. He was criticized for giving toys to hardened veterans. His answer: men are ruled by toys. A shop owner named Gunter Schmidt had an employee who kept getting the price tags wrong. Reminders failed, reprimands failed, meetings failed. So he gave her a title: Supervisor of Price Tag Posting, responsible for keeping every tag in the store correct. The problem was over, not improved, over. Titles and authorities sound trivial. They are not. Carnegie's 9th principle is, make the other person happy about doing the thing you suggest. And that is 30. 30 principles. 4 parts. Every one of them a way to get another human being to do what you'd like them to do. Which brings us, finally, to the accusation. Because you've been thinking it since about the 3rd principle. This is a manual for phonies. Learn a man's name so you can sell him something. Ask about his check so you can get his money. Praise the janitor so he'll work harder. It's a bag of tricks. Carnegie heard that in his own lifetime and every year since. And here is his answer, in his own words, buried in a chapter near the end where almost nobody quotes it. Let me repeat. The principles taught in this book will work only when they come from the heart. I am not advocating a bag of tricks. I'm talking about a new way of life. Only when they come from the heart. That's not a disclaimer he tacked on. It's the load-bearing wall. Every principle here has the same failure condition, and the failure condition is insincerity. We all crave appreciation, he writes, but nobody wants insincerity. Nobody wants flattery. And he is honest about the rest of it too, in a way the imitators never are. Nothing will work in all cases, he writes, and nothing will work with all people. He doesn't promise you 100%. He says, if you increase your successes by even a mere 10%, you have become 10% more effective than you were before, and that is your benefit. 10%. That's the actual offer. A man selling a system for winning friends telling you it fails most of the time. One of his own students, praising his children instead of yelling at them, reports the result and then adds, without being asked, it didn't last forever. Carnegie kept that line in. Notice what the trick manual reading cannot explain. A manipulator's handbook does not tell you its own hit rate. It does not tell you that the only thing that makes it work is meaning it. Go back to the man on the roof. Two-gun Crowley, bleeding through his coat, 150 guns pointed at him, writing to a world he was certain had wronged him. Under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one. He was completely sealed inside himself. Nobody had ever reached him, and by then, nobody could. Now hold that against a grocer in an American town, standing behind his counter, hearing a salesman say 4 syllables he had not heard spoken correctly in 15 years, and crying. Nicodemus Papadoulos. That is the distance this book covers, not from ignorance to technique, from a man nobody reached to a man somebody did. And the only thing that crossed it was one person deciding that another person was worth the 8 seconds of practice. Not a bag of tricks. A new way of life. Whose name are you about to say properly?